Hi, and welcome to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K, and today we'll be talking China. You cover Chinese history 6th to the 14th century. What are some of the themes there?
Well, I think it's important when you cover Chinese history that you can't start at the 6th century. One of the big themes is the rise and fall of dynasties and how that's seen in a sort of positive way in China. The other thing is of course the philosophy, the mandate of heaven. So the mandate of heaven, it's a kind of a political, social philosophy that's used to explain the success and the later, of course, failure of empire. So it's found in the classic of history. It's one of the 5 Confucian classics, and looks as though it's brought into use again in the Han Dynasty. So it just kind of explains maybe a dynasty lasts for 200 years, but starts to start to see floods or the foreign policy stops working and people are like, lost the mandate of heaven, time for a new dynasty. So that's one of the things, the mandate of heaven. The other is the rise and fall of dynasties, and you see that from the Shang all the way back to about 1000 BC up through the Jin, the Han, in the modern period. When I say modern period, I mean the AD period.
Of course.
The 6 dynasties, and then the ones that I usually focus on in that time frame that we're talking about are the Sui, the Tang, and then the Sung. The other thing about the rise and fall of dynasties is usually when trouble comes, it comes from the north. So they're always watching the north, and you see this in poetry with all sorts of social commentary, and then they'll talk about the danger coming from the north. So who's got their eye on the north, thinking mandate of heaven, but they also see the rise, this dynastic cycle, the rise and fall of dynasties, as something that's perfectly normal. Whereas if you were looking at Western history for the same period, and there's a collapse of a dynasty, it's like mad panic and civil wars, and so it's not seen in a positive way at all. But I think in China, this rise and fall of dynasties is kind of acceptable. So by the time you get to the Sui Dynasty, which is 581 to 617, really, really short dynasty, so obviously the mandate of heaven doesn't last too long there.
Yeah.
But by the time you get to the Sui Dynasty, you've already seen through all those other ones, the rise of stone cities, the creation of a hierarchical society, centralization of state, the I Ching, the Book of Rituals, mega projects like the one you call the Great Wall of China.
Oh yeah, I've heard of it.
Can it be seen from outer space or not? Chinese cosmonauts just recently up there said no, can't be seen from outer space. So that's a bit of a
how great of a wall could it be?
A bit of a myth. So you see that mega projects, development of law codes and taxation systems already in place. Long distance trade, especially in the Han period between Rome. China and Rome, China and India, and of course that develops into the Great Silk Road. And the other thing that happens in that period that you just can't ignore, you're talking about the sway of things that you can't ignore about the earlier period, is Confucian philosophy. And Confucian philosophy dominates until the end of the imperial age in China, and it seems to have made a bit of a comeback in the modern period. Communist Party. It's interesting. So I think Confucius. It's really important to understand him because his philosophy dominates into the modern era. So I'd say that mandate of heaven, rise and fall of dynasties, the fact that there's already a lot to build upon by the time you get to even a short dynasty like the Sui Dynasty.
So what about Confucius? Let's talk a little more about that.
Well, in modern popular culture in the West, people joke that Confucius say buy a lot of 640-90, and you get Confucian sayings supposedly in the other great Chinese invention, which I think was invented in San Francisco at the turn of the last century, and that's the fortune cookie. But Confucius is actually incredibly important to understanding Chinese statecraft, and I'll just, if I may, I have a little quote here from one of the Confucian analects.
By all means.
The analects, we have his analects, these are the sayings, or his sayings, but not written by him, but you have an iPad, you can download the Confucian Analects, I believe, for free on your.
Well, if it's free, then I might give it a shot.
So this is just one of them. Inaction could not help the world. The cause must be learned. This could only be done by historical study. So really important.
A historian pushing history.
Yeah.
Do you guys hear this?
Pushing history. I don't know.
Yeah. It's so important.
The most important thing about the past.
Confucius says it.
The past, exactly. I saw it in a fortune cookie at Safeway. So who is this guy? Well, he lived in a period called the period of the Warring States. That lasted from about 700 to 300 BC. And I say BC, and I should probably point out that most people use BP before the present, or BCE before the Common Era now. It's thought to be more scientific than before Christ and Anno Domini in the year of our Lord. But I'm a historian, so we'll be sticking to the old stuff. So BC and AD. So he's born about 551 BC and he dies in 479 BC. Remembering, of course, that BC goes from high numbers to 0. Right. And then 1 to whatever 2011 where we are just now. So he's born in into an era that's really, really violent, and his ideas aren't, really well accepted in the time that he lives in. But they dominate afterwards, as I said, dominate to the modern period. And I think some of the really important things that you can look up his life story, really easy to find anywhere. But he had a career in government, and then unhappy with that left and wandered about. My favorite word, peripatetic. Walked about and followed, and was followed by young men who wanted to enter government service. They wanted to learn, everything that they could, and so he taught them all the normal things. Plus, I guess this philosophy that was developing himself. And I think one of the interesting things about it is that he kind of believed that people could be education was really important, and that people could be educated to do the right thing. That force and threats only worked in the short term, and if kings wanted to have a stable and orderly society, then they had to set a good example. And he believed. I think he also believed that man was basically good. Other later Confucians a bit conflicted about that. Some thought men were kind of born bad, but could be educated to be good citizens. So one of the things that comes out of that is, of course, that he's living in a really violent age, but he believes that kings should be benevolent and set a good example. And that's not happening in his own time. So he looks back to the past, to the golden age when kings were, supposedly really good, set really good examples. And so that's why for him history is really important. He also has this idea that bad government should be rejected, even if that threatens the social order, which is very interesting because in the West, you see that with people like philosophers like Locke and Hobbes later on. We're looking at the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution. When is it okay to kill a king? When is it okay to get rid of a king? And Confucius is there, 2,000 years ahead of them, 1,500, 2,000 years ahead of them. So he believed that people should be honest and moral and courteous, and they should act well, but he believed that you needed to extend that beyond yourself and try to get other people to act in a good way.
Sounds like a pyramid scheme.
It does, or else, be all that you can be, a kind of army slogan, or participation, get out there and do stuff. So he believed that people should be active in the world. So he wouldn't have been, when Buddhism comes into China, he wouldn't probably have, keen on that idea of taking yourself out of the world. It seemed like you had to be part of it, you had to act. And he also, there's the 5 Confucian constant virtues: human-heartedness, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and sincerity. So Confucians argued about the nature of man, but they believed that if people learned about the past, that you could actually kind of turn them into really, really good citizens, and that the past could always be a guide. Historians love that kind of stuff. The past is a guide. You should strive
Keeps
to be
you in the money, doesn't it?
a benevolent person, and you should look to great leaders from the past as your example. So when you're talking about the rise of the dynastic cycle and the rise and fall of empires. He's living in a particularly violent one, but it's his philosophy that comes to dominate. And you can see it's particularly, I think, in the Tang Dynasty, although that's not probably the first one that we're going to talk about, but you can see it in the Tang Dynasty because it's the Confucian classics that students learn when they're going to write civil service exams. Civil service exams create this incredible meritocracy, this incredible administration of people who actually know a lot. So it's not government by power of force, it's government by intelligence, which you gotta be.
That's
Yeah,
sounds like a good way to run it. To be honest.
If you think about the normal civil services in the West, they really come into being, I think, in the late 19th century. So that's 23 centuries before, so I was
bit of a head start.
I went to China and I brought back Confucian ideology.
Getting back to this dynastic cycle, you said there was a kind of normal rise and fall. So what happened after the age of 6 dynasties?
Okay, so the age of 6 dynasties, that comes after a really stable period, the Han period, and the age of 6 dynasties lasts from about 220 to about 589, and of course it ends with trouble in the north, powerful generals.
Of course it does.
Yeah, like you could tell by then,
I would have guessed that.
I wouldn't have been looking south. I wouldn't have been going, okay, what's that out there in the ocean? I'd been like, the north.
Although the smart thing to do would be to come from the south because of that.
Well, that's true. And if you hadn't been Chinese and invented the compass, maybe you wouldn't know where the north was. Ooh, maybe that was the problem early on.
Yeah.
Like, where is the north? I know the trouble's there. I have no idea.
Lots of bad people come that way.
I have no idea where it is. So anyway, you get the re-emergence of a fairly strong dynasty, although it's a really short one, the Sui Dynasty, 581 to about 617. But it's important because it shows the dynastic cycle at work, this whole process at work. You get the older themes of the mega projects coming up, lots of earlier irrigation schemes, of course, the Great Wall, but in this case, it's the building of the Grand Canal, and so that looks good. But again, it's a really short dynasty, so you see a loss of the mandate of heaven quite quickly, and it appears to have something to do with the 3 failed campaigns that the Chinese launch or mount against Korea, and again, trouble from the north. Failures against Korea.
I sense a recurring theme.
Yeah, I know. So you have Yang Xian of a northern aristocratic family founding the Sui Dynasty, that's Sui, in case my Scottish accent makes it sound like anything else. Sui adopted Buddhism as the state doctrine, so Confucianism isn't the state doctrine at this point, but probably still followed by most people. But the state doctrine, Buddhism, and of course the interesting thing about that is he's able to use Buddhist monks in his administration. Now, if you were looking for examples from the West, you could look at the rise of the Carolingian Empire with Charlemagne using Christian monks as his administrators because of course they can read and write, they're literate, right? So same idea here, using monks in administrative posts. He's followed by his son Sui Di, and it's Sui Di that starts the Grand Canal scheme. So it's 1,400 miles long when it's fully finished. It's completed in 610 AD, and I think he also extended the Great Wall while he was at it. The Grand Canal is built between the 2 key rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze River, built by conscripted labour, just as the Great Wall had been, about 2 million men involved in that. Of course, you might live and die while the building is going on. He also taxed his people to pay for it, so they're conscripted into labor force and they're taxed for it, and then they don't really get to use it because it's to speed up imperial communication. It's to be used for the deployment of troops, and it's also used to move grain from the south to the more populous north. So it's not like you go, the Grand Canal's open, let's go for a wee spin up and down the Grand, get your rowing boat out, we'll row up and down. It's not going to be like that at all. But Sui Di, because his foreign campaigns were such a failure, and couldn't get the Korean leaders to kowtow to him. The 3 military expeditions are a bit of a disaster, and in 618 he's replaced by one of his own generals. Is actually, when I say replaced of being kind, he's actually murdered in his palace by Li Wan, and Li Wan goes on to establish the Tang Dynasty.
Okay, that's it for part 1 of the video.
Good. Okay,
that's it for part 1. So
did I just show my book? China's Cosmopolitan Empire, the Tang Dynasty by Mark Edward Lewis. Just excellent. Have a look at that if you get the chance.
We'll see you in part 2.
Okay. Bye.